March 28th, Monday, 2022. This is PODDOM, the Daily News Broadcast. Putin not seen ready to compromise ahead of peace talks. Talks arranged after call between Erdogan and Putin. 160,000 people still trapped in Mariupol. Russians turn effort towards separatist areas. Leave Kharkiv, Ukraine, March 28th. Ukraine and Russia were preparing on Monday for the first face-to-face peace talks in more than 2 weeks, but a senior U.S. official said Russian President Vladimir Putin did not appear ready to make compromises to end the war. Ukrainian officials also played down the chances of a major breakthrough of the talks due to be held in Istanbul after Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan spoke to Russian Vladimir Putin on Sunday. But the fact that they were taking place in person at all, for the first time since an acrimonious meeting between foreign ministers on March 10th, was a sign of shifts behind the scenes as Russia's invasion has stalled and sanctions have hit home. There was no sign of respite for civilians in besieged Ukrainian cities, especially the devastated port of Mariupol, whose mayor said 160,000 people were still trapped inside, and Russia was blocking attempts to evacuate them. But the mayor of Irpin, near Kyiv, said Ukrainian forces had seized back full control of the town. "We have good news today. Irpin has been liberated," Alexander Markushin said, adding that it expected further attacks. The Ukrainians are continuing to try to take back ground, a senior U.S. defense official said, on condition of anonymity, telling reporters that the eastern town of Trostinets, south of Sumy, was back in Ukrainian hands. Russia's defense ministry, for its part, said its troops had destroyed large ammunition depots in the Zhytomyr region west of Kyiv and had hit 41 Ukrainian military sites in the past 24 hours. Reuters could not immediately verify any of the reports. In Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city and one of its hardest hit, people were sweeping rubble out of a classroom on the third story of a school, where a wall had been blown away by a missile before dawn. They've been not able to take the city, so they've decided to destroy it, said Alexander, who had been sheltering with his mother on a lower floor of the school after their own neighborhood was hit. Changed their goals. Russia's military signified last week it would concentrate on expanding territory held by separatists in eastern Ukraine, but Ukraine said it saw no sign of Russia had given up a plan to surround the capital, which it targeted on its February 24 invasion. Kyiv's mayor Vital Klitschko said 100 people had been killed, including children, and 82 multi-story buildings had been destroyed. It was not possible to verify the figures. "We have destroyed the myth of the invincible Russian army. We are resisting against the aggression of one of the strongest armies in the world and have succeeded in making them change their goals," Klitschko said. Ukrainian officials have recently suggested Russia could be more willing to compromise, having seen stiff Ukrainian resistance and heavy Russian losses. But a senior U.S. State Department official said Putin did not give that impression. "Everything I have seen is he is not willing to compromise at this point," the official told Reuters on condition of anonymity after Ukraine's president sketched out a potential way to end the crisis over the weekend. Russia and Ukraine said talks would start in Turkey on Tuesday. When the sides last met in person, Ukraine accused Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of ignoring pleas to discuss a certain ceasefire, while Lavrov said a halt to fighting was not even on the agenda. Since then, they have held talks via video link and publicly discussed a formula under which Ukraine might accept some kind of formal neutral status. But neither side has budged over Russia's territorial demands, including Crimea, which Moscow sees annexed in 2014, and eastern territories known as the Donbas, which Moscow demands Kyiv cede to separatists. I don't think there will be any breakthrough on the main issues, Ukrainian Interior Minister Advisor Vadim Denchenko said. In an interview with Russian journalists at the weekend, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky mentioned some form of compromise involving Donbas, although he did not suggest this might involve ceding the territory. He has since said territorial integrity remained Kyiv's priority. Biden call alarming. The Kremlin said Biden's surprise comment about Putin at the end of a speech in Warsaw at the weekend, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," was certainly alarming after earlier saying it was up to Russians to choose their leader. On Sunday, Biden said he was not calling for regime change. Russia calls its action in Ukraine a special military operation to disarm and denazify its neighbor, Kyiv, and the West consider this a pretext for an unprovoked invasion to try to topple the elected Ukrainian government. Last week, Ukrainian forces pushed Russian troops back in areas around Kyiv, the northeast and the southwest, while Russia kept up pressure in the southeast near separatist areas, including its devastating siege on Mariupol. Mayor Vadim Boychenko, speaking from an undisclosed location outside the city, said 26 buses were waiting to evacuate some 160,000 trapped civilians, but Russia was denying safe passage. People are beyond the line of humanitarian catastrophe, Boychenko said on national television. We need to completely evacuate Mariupol. A spokesperson for Boychenko said later that nearly 5,000 people had been killed and 90% of buildings had damaged, of which 40% were destroyed. Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said intelligence reports of possible Russian provocations along evacuation routes out of besieged cities meant there were no plans for such evacuations on Monday. Elsewhere, Russia's armored columns are bogged down with trouble resupplying and making little or no progress. Britain's defense minister said there had been no major change in Russia's position in the past 24 hours, with most Russian gains near Mariupol and heavy fighting underway there. As of today, the enemy is regrouping its forces, but they cannot advance anywhere in Ukraine, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said. Biden's budget boosts military, raises taxes on billionaires and companies. Washington, March 28. U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday submitted a $5.79 trillion budget plan to Congress that calls for record peacetime military spending while raising taxes for billionaires and companies and lowering government deficits. Biden's budget proposal for the 2023 fiscal year, starting October 1st, lays out his administration's priorities, including campaign promises to make the wealthy and companies pay more tax. but it is merely a wish list as lawmakers on Capitol Hill make the final decisions on budget matters. The plan is based on economic assumptions locked in on November 10, well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has exacerbated previous inflationary pressures on energy and food prices. Biden's top economic advisor, Cecilia Rouse, said the administration still sees inflation easing over the coming year. The budget I am releasing today sends a clear message that we value fiscal responsibility, safety, and security at home and around the world, and the investments needed to continue our equitable growth and build a better America, said Biden in a statement. The Democratic president said he was calling for higher defense spending to strengthen the U.S. military and forcefully respond to Russian President Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine with $1 billion in additional U.S. support for Ukraine's economic, humanitarian, and security needs. The document offers fresh insight into Biden's thinking as he attempts to halt the largest war in Europe since World War II and prepares for a November 8 midterm election that could see his Democratic Party lose control of Congress. Biden said his administration was on track to reduce the federal deficit by more than $1.3 trillion this year, having the deficit form from the last year of the previous Trump's administration while expanding the economy. My budget will continue that progress, further reducing the deficit by continuing to support the economic growth that has increased revenues and ensuring that billionaires and large corporations pay their fair share, he said. Biden's plan also calls for increased spending on community policing, fighting gun crime, and investing in crime prevention and community violence interventions, as well as added funding for affordable housing. Billionaire tax. Forced by disagreements within its own party to pump the brakes on and instead continue negotiating on vast swaths of his domestic Build Back Better agenda, Biden's budget does not include line items for his plans on how to improve the country's environment, healthcare, education, housing infrastructure, and manufacturing competitiveness. It does call for a new minimum tax requiring billionaires to pay at least 20% of income taxes, including on the gains on investments that have not been sold. That tax would apply to 0.01% of American households, those worth over $100 million, with more than half of the new revenue coming from households worth more than $1 billion, the White House said. It would reduce the government deficit by $360 billion over the next decade, it added. Biden has long pushed the message that the U.S. tax system rewards the wealthy too much and that the rich should pay for more social services. The budget also would raise the corporate tax to 28% while including other changes to the corporate tax code that incentivize job creation and investment. It calls for $773 billion for the Department of Defense, which combined with other spending would lead to a total national security budget above $800 billion. Russia's February 24 invasion of Ukraine has intensified concerns about European security, while the Biden administration continues to invest in research and development of hypersonic missiles and other modern capabilities. The United States is not directly engaged against Russia in the Ukraine war, but is giving Kyiv weapons and extensive assistance. Working with European allies, it has also imposed heavy economic sanctions against Russia. The U.S. federal government, on the hook for rising healthcare and social spending, especially for older Americans, has spent more money than it has taken in for each of the last 20 years. Florida governor signs bill limiting LGBTQ instruction in schools. March 28. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis on Monday signed into law a Republican-backed bill that would prohibit classroom instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity for many young students. The legislation, referred to by its opponents as the Don't Say Gay bill, has stirred national controversy amid an increasingly partisan debate over what schools should teach children about race and gender. We will continue to recognize that in the state of Florida, parents have a fundamental role in the education, health care, and well-being of their children, DeSantis told a press conference before signing the bill. I don't care what big corporations say. Here I stand, and I'm not backing down. Students across Florida have protested the measure. President Joe Biden called it hateful, and some corporate trade leaders, including Walt Disney Company Chief Executive Officer Bob Chapek, have expressed concern about its bill becoming law. DeSantis, who is seeking re-election this year and is widely considered a 2024 presidential candidate, has joined other Republicans in calling for parents to have more control over what young children learn in school. Formerly called the Parental Rights in Education Bill, the Florida measure bars classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity for children in kindergarten through third grade, or from about ages 5 through 9 in public schools. It also prohibits such teaching that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in other grades. Under the law, parents will be allowed to sue school districts they believe to be in violation. LGBTQ and civil rights advocates, as well as Democratic politicians, have said such policies will harm the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community. The legislation has been criticized for the vagueness and complexity of some of its language. For example, it says that even discussion of gender identity and sexual orientation is prohibited in certain grade levels or in a specified manner. Trump likely committed felony with plan to obstruct Congress, U.S. judge rules. Washington, March 28. A U.S. judge ruled on Monday that former President Donald Trump more likely than not committed a felony by trying to pressure his vice president to obstruct Congress and overturn his election defeat on January 6, 2021. The assertion was in a ruling that found the House of Representatives Committee probing the deadly attack on the U.S. Capitol has a right to see emails written to Trump by one of his then lawyers, John Eastman. U.S. District Judge David Carter in Los Angeles said that Republican Trump's plan to overturn his November 2020 election defeat to Democrat Joe Biden amounted to a coup. The court finds it more likely than not that President Trump corruptly attempted to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021, Carter said in a written decision, adding, "The illegality of the plan was obvious." Representatives of Trump and Los Angeles-based Eastman did not respond to requests for comment. Carter's findings marked a breakthrough for the Democratic-led January 6 Select Committee, which earlier this month said it believed Trump might have committed multiple felonies. The panel is expected to make a formal request to the U.S. Justice Department that it consider charging Trump. Both Carter and the committee lack the power to bring criminal charges against Trump. That decision would need to be made by U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland for violations of federal law. A Justice Department spokesman did not respond to a request for comment. While the evidence continues to mount that Trump and many around him attempted a self-coup, it's still stunning to see a federal judge come to that conclusion in writing, said Jessica Levinson, a professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, not involved in the case. The Capitol riot occurred as then Vice President Mike Pence and members of both chambers of Congress were meeting to certify Biden as the election winner. Dr. Eastman and President Trump launched a campaign to overturn a Democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history, Carter wrote. Their campaign was not confined to the ivory tower. It was a coup in search of a legal theory. Before a mob of thousands stormed the Capitol, Trump gave a fiery speech in which he falsely claimed his election defeat was the result of widespread fraud, an assertion rejected by multiple courts, state election officials, and members of his own administration. U.S. Capitol attack probe may seek interview with Justice Thomas's wife. Washington, March 28. The congressional panel investigating the deadly January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol may seek an interview with Virginia Thomas, a Republican activist and wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, a source familiar with the matter said on Monday. The U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee has conducted hundreds of interviews in its investigation of the attack on the Capitol last year by supporters of former President Donald Trump as lawmakers were poised to certify the 2020 election. Several media outlets, including CNN on Monday, have reported the committee's possible interest in hearing from Virginia Thomas since her texts with Trump's then Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, were made public last week in a Washington Post CBS report. The source familiar said a decision had not yet been made on whether to request an interview. Virginia Thomas, who goes by Ginny, is active in conservative circles and earlier this month said in a separate media interview that she had attended Trump's rally hours before the Capitol riot. In a series of 29 messages to Meadows following Trump's loss, Thomas repeatedly asked Meadows to work to overturn the election results. Meadows was found in contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate fully with the January 6 probe. Representatives for Ginny Thomas could not immediately be reached for comment. Representatives for Clarence Thomas and the Supreme Court also could not immediately be reached. The January 6 Select Committee declined comment. Thomas, who the court said was hospitalized last week for an infection, was the lone dissenting voice in January when the U.S. Supreme Court rejected Trump's request to block the release of White House records sought by the congressional panel. The Select Committee is scheduled to hold a business meeting later on Monday to vote on a report recommending the full House hold Peter Navarro, a former trade advisor to ex-President Donald Trump, and Daniel Scavino, who was a Trump deputy chief of staff, in contempt of Congress for not cooperating with the probe. U.S. Supreme Court to decide copyright fight over Warhol's Prince paintings. Washington, March 28. In a case that could help clarify when and how artists can make use of the work of others, the U.S. Supreme Court on Monday agreed to decide a copyright dispute between a photographer and Andy Warhol's estate over Warhol's 1984 paintings of rock star Prince. The justices took up the Andy Warhol's Foundation's appeal of a lower court ruling that his paintings, based on a photo of Prince that photographer Lynn Goldsmith had shot for Newsweek magazine in 1981, were not protected by the copyright law doctrine called fair use. The doctrine permits unlicensed use of copyright protected works under certain circumstances. Goldsmith, 74, countersued Warhol's estate for infringement in 2017 over Warhol's unlicensed paintings of Prince after the estate asked a Manhattan federal court to find that his works did not violate her rights. Warhol, who died in 1987, often based his art on photographs. Goldsmith, who has said she did not learn about the unlicensed works until after Prince died in 2016, asked the court to block Warhol's estate from making further use of her work and for an unspecified amount of money damages. A judge ruled that Warhol's works were protected against Goldsmith's infringement claims by the fair use doctrine, finding they transformed Goldsmith's portrayal of Prince as a vulnerable human being by depicting him as an iconic, larger-than-life figure. After Goldsmith challenged that decision, the New York-based Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last year found that Warhol's paintings had not made fair use of the photo, allowing Goldsmith's case to proceed. The Second Circuit decided that in a transformative work must have a fundamentally different and new artistic purpose and character, and that Warhol's paintings were much closer to presenting the same work in a different form. The Andy Warhol Foundation asked the Supreme Court in December to overturn the second court decision, arguing that it created a cloud of legal uncertainty for an entire genre of art like Warhol's. The Supreme Court addressed the issue of copyright fair use last year in a ruling finding that the fair use of Oracle Corporation software code by Alphabet Incorporation's Google in its Android operating system was protected. In 1994, Supreme Court ruling on fair use involving artistic creation, the justices found that rap group Two Live Crew's parody of Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman made fair use of Orbison's song. Warhol Foundation attorney Roman Martinez said he welcomed the High Court's decision to hear the case and hopes it will recognize that Andy Warhol's transformative works of art are fully protected by law. An attorney of Goldsmith did not immediately respond to a request for comment. U.S. Supreme Court to decide copyright fight over Warhol's Prince paintings. Washington, March 28. In a case that could help clarify when and how artists can make use of the work of others, the U.S. Supreme Court on Monday agreed to decide a copyright dispute between a photographer and Andy Warhol's estate over Warhol's 1984 paintings of rock star Prince. The justice took up the Andy Warhol Foundation's appeal of the lower court, ruling that his paintings, based on a photo of Prince that photographer Lynn Goldsmith had shot for Newsweek magazine in 1981, were not protected by the copyright law doctrine called fair use. This doctrine permits unlicensed use of copyright-protected works under certain circumstances. Goldsmith, 74, countersued Warhol's estate for infringement in 2017 over Warhol's unlicensed paintings of Prince after the estate asked a Manhattan federal court to find that his works did not violate her rights. Warhol, who died in 1987, often based his art on photographs. Goldsmith, who has said she did not learn about the unlicensed works until after Prince died in 2016, asked the court to block Warhol's estate from making further use of her work and for an unspecified amount of money damages. A judge ruled that Warhol's works were protected against Goldsmith's infringement claims by the fair use doctrine, finding they transformed Goldsmith's portrayal of Prince as a vulnerable human being by depicting him as an iconic, larger-than-life figure. After Goldsmith challenged that decision, the New York-based Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals last year found that Warhol's paintings had not made fair use of the photo, allowing Goldsmith's case to proceed. The Second Circuit decided that in a transformative work, the Second Circuit decided that a transformative work must have a fundamentally different and new artistic purpose and character, and that Warhol's paintings were much closer to presenting the same work in a different form. The Andy Warhol Foundation asked the Supreme Court in December to overturn the Second Circuit decision, arguing that it created a cloud of legal uncertainty for an entire genre of the art like Warhol's. The Supreme Court addressed the issue of copyright fair use last year in a ruling finding that the use of Oracle Port software code by Alphabet Incorporated Google in its Android operating system was protected. In 1994, Supreme Court ruling on fair use involving artistic creation, the justices found that rap group T.Y.Q's parody of Roy Orbison's Old Pretty Woman claimed fair use of Orbison's song. Warhol Foundation attorney Roman Martinez said he welcomed the High Court's decision to hear the case and hopes it will recognize that Andy Warhol's transformative works of art are fully protected by law. An attorney for Goldsmith did not immediately respond for a request for comment.